Well, hopefully everyone in the Zoom world can hear me. But hello and welcome to day one of Uncanny Beliefs, Superstition in Modern Chinese History. I'm Emily Baum, and this two-day conference and workshop is sponsored by the Long U.S.-China Institute at UC Irvine. So the inspiration behind this conference originated close to a year ago in a conversation that I was having with Albert Wu, who is a researcher at Academia Sinica in Taiwan, who also happens to be with us here today. Both of us were doing research on topics related to superstition. He was more focused on the late imperial period. I was focused more on Maoist China. But both of us, like so many historians of modern China these days, we're just waylaid by our inability to travel to the PRC and do research there. For me personally, I had been planning to write a book on divination and superstition in the early PRC, but I ultimately decided to abandon that project just in the wake of COVID, in the wake of my inability to travel overseas. Nevertheless, both Albert and I wanted to keep one foot in the world of superstition studies, and so we decided that a good way to do so was by convening a series of conferences and then hopefully putting together an edited volume. So this Irvine conference is actually the first in what will be a series of two conferences. The second is scheduled to be held in Taiwan in September. We are crossing our fingers that we will be able to actually make it happen. One never knows from day to day how COVID regulations are going to shift. But altogether, we have 17 participants. Everyone has either submitted a chapter or they are going to submit a chapter, and we are very excited to share some of those chapters with you today. So the conference itself is going to be organized into a morning session and an afternoon session. In the morning, we'll be giving normal conference presentations, and then in the afternoon, we'll be doing some intensive workshopping of these individual papers. Okay, so before we kick things off, I just wanted to express my gratitude to all of the people and the departments that have helped make this conference a possibility. So thank you very much to Yimin Lai, my postdoc, who has done a ton of legwork and who is responsible for the beautiful programs that you have with you today. I'd also like to thank Michelle Spivey and Mark Panda in the history department, who have really been a lifeline in so many ways. Brian Gurney at the Humanities Center, Alicia Casado, Penny Vo, and Heather Ashbach in the School of Social Sciences, Juhun Sin, Colin Andrews, UCI History Department, and UCI Facilities Management. I would not have been able to do this without their help, and so I'm very grateful to them. Okay, so without any further ado, I will introduce our first panel on gender and superstition. So presenting first is Long Yang, who is a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Freiburg, and he will be followed by Vincent Chen, who is a doctoral candidate at Ohio State University and who's currently a doctoral fellow at Academia Sinica in Taiwan. Each will present for approximately 15 minutes, and then we will have discussant remarks from Dr. Hu Ying, who is professor and chair of the Department of East Asian Studies at UCI. After the discussant remarks, we will open it up for audience Q&A. For those of you who are joining via Zoom, you are more than free to ask your questions. Please do so using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We'll collect the questions and ask them on your behalf. So I will turn this over now to Long Yang.
Okay. Thank you so much, Emily, and a special thanks to Emily and Albert for organizing this workshop series. My paper is about how male cadres constructed their masculine status to shape the Maoist authority in everyday life in the early 1960s. According to the CCP, in the wake of the Great Leap Forward, individuals started participating in the so-called feudal superstitious activities, such as funerals, divination, and fortune-telling. A large number of cadres were said to have been active in these activities. The CCP thus decided to investigate these cadres during the socialist education movement between 1962 and 66. This campaign aimed to focus on their misconduct like corruption, gambling, and the mismanagement of collective property. The personal dossiers of these cadres recorded when, how, and why they did these things. For example, in a 1962 case, a male cadre claimed the loss of 50 kilograms of corn and tried to retrieve it by performing divination. He brought one mirror and one of the collective cow to the courtyard of the brigade party committee's office. And he looked at the cow with the mirror in front of the villagers. In local belief systems, the cow god Liu Wangsen, originally from Indian Buddhism, was crucial to protecting property and helping people catch thieves. The cadre then said that he was seeing from the mirror that a villager had stolen the corn. He thus ordered the villager to return the corn and give him an extra 20 yuan as compensation. During the campaign, villagers eventually had the opportunity to voice out their resentment. As one villager revealed in his testimony, what he knew was that the accused villager often disobeyed the cadre's management during work and in other situations. The divination event created by the cadre became a means for him to display his power as a cadre. So the story seems not to fit the existing characterization of the nature of the Maoist state. There is a long-standing assumption that the Maoist state was highly suppressive and exercised totalistic control over society. Recent studies have suggested that the presence and resilience of superstitious activities in the early 1960s was an indicate of the limits of the Maoist states. No, actually, however, no matter the Maoist state is highly suppressive or limited suppressive, both approaches still stabilized the line between state and society. Instead, I argue that at the everyday level, the Maoist state and the local superstitious authority were mutually constituted by mere cadres who made their power through both institutions. The participation in and organization of such activities were often intervened with their status as cadres. They incorporated their political power into the practices of the activities to maintain their authority. This paper also demonstrates that it was often only male cadres made use of superstitious resources to shape their power, although female cadres took up a total of about 18% of posts at the brigade and production team levels in the 1960s. The display of authority in these activities produced their masculine status. Of the total of 350 personal dossiers of cadre from Hebei province I read, only one female cadre was accused of engaging in the superstitious activities by lighting incense and burning paperwork in the field to commemorate her later parents and later grandparents. So when we work on the early years of Mao's China, we know that political campaigns often resulted in the production of a substantial amount of archives. In particular, the socialist education movement produced the largest amount of materials about village politics and life in modern China. If you visit this kind of local archives in China about village life, basically it's the socialist education movement. And the Cadres personal dossiers are particularly useful. They contain the very details of Cadres' daily work and lives. My current book project on Cadres and the Maoist state relies on personal dossiers and other official documents from the campaign, and this paper is part of this project. So the problem is why the CCP decided to detail cadres' participation in superstitious activities in their dossiers. At the beginning of the campaign, local officials at the county and municipal levels tried to classify most of such activities as ordinary superstitious activities, 一般迷信活动. However, the CCP top leadership understood them as a potential threat to the regime. With the campaign sweeping across the country, work teams dispatched by higher party and government organs to carry out the campaign in the countryside had to investigate them. Work teams thus then categorized cadres' engagement in superstitious activities as part of the political mistake. 政治不齐. This means that work teams accepted the CCP top leadership's argument. So reading through the personal dossiers, we can find that the accusations of cadres' participation in superstitious activities often involved funeral ceremonies. This is a very contemporary picture. It's not what happened in the 1960s, but can make sense how they performed this. So the use of the ceremonies to acquire respect and social standing was important for cadres to sustain their power. Local knowledge of ceremonies did mostly not conform to the broad characterization of the state-sponsored ideas of ceremonies at that time. The state discouraged many traditional rituals in funerals. However, performing such rituals in the countryside was still widely accepted. In a 1964 case, a brigade cadre dressed in the deep mourning for the funeral of an elder woman who had given him food and clothes when he was a child living in a poor household. The local party and government organs clarified the woman's husband as a landlord during land reform in the later 1940s. But this guy became a cadre in the 1950s and still maintained a good relationship with the woman's family. So when the woman passed away, people from her village first did not attend the funeral because of her family's bad class status. The cadre then decided to bring his whole family to the funeral. What's more, he paid respects to the dead by sending paper money to her family and dressed in the same way as the later women's son in the rituals. There were strict norms on the dress in funeral according to their positions in the kinship to the dead. So after seeing his act, villagers felt no choice but to send paper money to the woman's family to show their respects, actually both to the dead and also to the cadre. The ceremony then became a major public event in the community with a large number of villagers engaging in it. So cadres also sometimes overused funeral ceremonies to shape their power. In particular, when ceremonies involved 磕头, cadres could misuse it to strengthen the superior-subordinate relationship with villages. In a 1964 case, a brigade cadre held a ceremony for carrying his mother's coffin to the graveyard. According to local norms, he should have held his mother's memorial tablet, 牌位, on the way to the graveyard, but he changed the rituals. He not only asked his son to hold the memorial tablet, but also ordered 4 villagers, male villagers, to carry his son from his home to the graveyard. What's more, rather than taking the regular course to conduct the ceremony, he decided to carry his mother's coffin and his son to walk around the village. Also, according to his demand, other villagers locked their heads to the ground when his son held the memorial tablet, passing by their houses. So in daily work, facing villagers' disobedience to their orders, cadres sometimes demonstrated their authority by ordering them to kneel down and 磕头. The CCP understood this as part of the cadres' abuse of power. Actually, in the early 1960s, villagers also made the similar argument, as indicated by one villager's testimony. The cadres' overuse of the ceremony demonstrate his status as a local emperor of the village, 土皇帝. So let me conclude a little bit. The enactments of the state power in everyday life relied on cadres. It was not only the imposition of the bureaucratic organization from above that empowered them, rather, cadres had agency and established power from both the state bureaucracy as well as local institutions. Performing divination and rituals became part of driving force shaping their power. When cadres made use of superstitious resources to draw their power, their actions blurred the line between state and society. Their actions provided a mechanism for themselves to make the state power visible in everyday life. What's more, the enactments of state power also dependent on the male-dominated political culture in the countryside. It was almost only male cadres who made use of superstitious activities to establish their power. On some occasions, they displayed their manhood, dignity, and faith to obtain others' obedience during work and in other situations. That's my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Long. And next we will hear from Vincent Chen.
Okay. Thank you everyone for being here, and I apologize first, but I have to sneeze. Don't worry, I tested negative this morning. Just I'm having an allergy attack. So, my presentation today is, in fact, a case study on women's mosques within Sino Muslim communities in modern China. So, first, I will give a very brief intro to the terms I'll be using here. For a start, Sino-Muslims are also referred to as the Hui people, Sino-Muslims, Chinese-speaking Muslims, Chinese Muslims, or simply Muslim Chinese. So whichever appellation you prefer, what concerns us here today is that I'm not talking about Turkic Muslims like the Uyghurs. As for women's mosques, it's a unique institution that exists mostly in North and Central China. So we've learned a lot about them thanks to Maria Yashov and Shui Jinping's magnum opus. Traditionally, the mosque is a male-dominated place, but in Henan province around 300 years ago, they started to have these mosques exclusive to women and organized by female leaders. Some of them even had female imams. Beginning as a historical incident, women's mosques mushroomed during the Republican era in provinces around Henan and in big cities including Beijing, Nanjing, Tianjin, and Shanghai. It is estimated that there were about 150 of them during this period. This phenomenal expansion was, on the one hand, related to Muslim migrants from Henan, who brought this tradition to other places with them. But also, the rising waves of women's movement encouraged Muslim reformers to experiment with such an institution, and hence, women's mosques became way much more widespread than it had used to be. To be clear, women's mosques are unique, but not exclusive to Muslims in China. For example, there are or used to be a historical tradition of women's mosques in the Maldives. And today, there are several women's mosques in North America, Africa, Europe, and India. But since women's mosques are supposed to have a 30th century long tradition in China, many people do take inspiration from Sinophone Muslims. And often, people see women's mosques in China as a proof of how an inclusive form of Islam can work in modern societies. Against this background, imagine my surprise when I discovered this. In 1934, many Muslims complained about the evil customs in these women's schools. Note that they refused to call them women's mosques, and they refer to these female imams merely as female teachers. One Muslim wrote, quote, "Many female teachers like to parade their learning. One said that she had a dream of the Prophet. Another said that she dreamed of angels. There were so many farces that went against the Islamic law. Later, this respectable women's mosque was finally shut down thanks to someone's intervention," unquote. Similarly, another imam said, quote, "These so-called female imams and female teachers act almost like those of the White Lotus sectarians. The so-called women's mosques are their institution to propagate superstitions and to scam for money," unquote. These words didn't sound like a model of inclusion, did it? But such portrayal of women's mosques coming from Sinophone Muslims almost never shows up in previous literature, except several passing references. So, to present what was actually happening during that time, first I'll explain how the elements of women, nation, and superstition got entangled together in Sinophone Muslims' reform discourses. And then I will explain how male Muslim reformers legitimized women's mosques. And finally, I would like to make a remark on how elite women's vision for reform was different from the ones of their male counterparts. During the Republican era, many Muslim males vowed to reform the customs based on the classic. What exactly were the customs? One of their targets was the old wives' tales, 老妈妈论, that allegedly many Muslim women believed in, including divination, geomancy, or beliefs like it is inauspicious to look into the mirror at midnight, etc. Many men worried that these so-called Chinese practices would corrupt women's faith. But then, what was the classic? To some Muslims, the classic here undoubtedly means the scripture, the Quran. But to most Sinophone Muslims, classics can range from serious Islamic works to basically anything written in the Arabic script. As we will see, the flexibility of the term provided room for maneuver, allowing some Muslims to reconfigure the landscape of Islamic jurisprudence. On the one hand, as we'll probably hear many times during this workshop, the nationalist government during the Republican era tried to delineate and codify the boundary between what was religious and what was superstitious. The official ideology saw the purge of superstitious behavior as a progress of modernization. Many Sinophone Muslims appropriated the official discourses for their own reform agenda. And after all, Islamic resources never lacked such theological resources to go against disbelief, superstition, and innovation, or even heresy. On the other hand, the woman question was a major theme during the Republican era. Chinese intellectuals, both Muslim and non-Muslims alike, saw the importance of women in the nation's future. But people disagreed on what exactly women's role should be in an ideal modern society. In response to the discussions, in 1930, two major Mandarin Islamic periodicals each devoted a special issue to women. So, what would happen when the woman question met the ideology of anti-superstition? Well, recent scholarship had taught us that male reformers in modern China often regarded women's agency in religious practices as problematic. Many reformers tried to regulate women's behavior through their educational programs and anti-superstition campaigns. It turned out that the same kind of male anxiety toward women's religiosity also existed among Muslims as well. With this background, it should now be easier to understand why the women's mosques became involved in such discussions. Many Muslims had genuine concerns about the legitimacy of having women's mosques in terms of Islamic law, especially in terms of legal classics in Hanafism. And Hanafism is the branch of Islamic law that Sinophone Muslims follow. Citing these classics, many imams reaffirmed the idea that, first, women should not assume men's titles such as al-Khund and imam. Second, and more importantly, the Hanafi classics specify that it is undesirable or even reprehensible for women to perform congregational prayers by themselves. Subsequently, because women do not have their own congregational prayers, they shall not have mosques, and they shall not perform calls to prayers. Based on these reasons, these imams argue that women's mosques were essentially an illegitimate heretical innovation. As an alternative, these imams suggested that women may come to these schools to learn how to perform prayers, but they need to return home once they learn it. Even if women needed to pray together as they learn how to perform prayers, they should not stand in lines, but rather in a disordered fashion so that they wouldn't be performing congregational prayers, but each of them doing their individual prayer alone. Thus, to effectively defend women's mosques, then, supporters needed to find justification from within Islamic jurisprudence itself. The person who made a significant contribution to this topic was the great Imam Wang Jingzhai, who is known for his Chinese translation of the Quran in 1932, which had influenced generations of Sinophone Muslims up till the 1980s. And aside from the Quran, Imam Wang also had an interest in Islamic law. He once lamented that there hadn't been any famous Islamic jurists in Chinese history, and he thought that the debates on women's mosques did not seriously touch upon Islamic jurisprudence. So, in 1931, he published a Chinese translation of the Wigoya, which is a canonical work of legal opinions in the Hanafi school. And also, he accompanied his translations with different commentaries and super commentaries on the Wigoya. So these commentaries provided him ammunition to participate in the debate on the mosques. So when people said that, oh, Hanafi classics forbid women to have congregational prayers, Wang Jingzhai and his friend refuted them by saying that, quote, "You do not know the full picture of Hanafi jurisprudence. According to the classics called Umdatul Ayah and Tuhfatul Nubalaa, in the early days of Islam, the wives of the Prophet had served as the imam for women during the obligatory prayers." Unquote. And so it appears that Wang and his friend have found two Hanafi classics that justify the legitimacy of women's mosques. And in later writings, we did see people cite the same two classics as well, which suggests that Wang's writing has certain influences. But where did they come from? These two magical classics that justify women's mosques. In fact, they were the works by Abdul Hayy al-Laknawi, a 19th-century Hanafi jurist based in Lucknow, India. And although al-Laknawi was indeed a very influential and important Hanafi jurist, Wang Xingjia had omitted a very critical information. That is, al-Laknawi's position on women's mosques was single-handedly different from the majority, and actually all, of canonical jurists in the Hanafi school. So, in other words, by referring to al-Laknawi's work as classics, just like the way people refer to any other canonical works, Imam Wang, in his translation, obfuscated the supposed hierarchy between canonical works and their commentaries. He was thus able to highlight al-Laknawi's opinions, presenting them as if they were universal, and effectively reshape the landscape of Hanafi jurisprudence in modern China. The influence of Imam Wang continues to even this day. For instance, during a symposium in 2016, the female Imam Ge Caixia from Henan cited the classic of Vigoya to defend the legal basis of women's mosques. And yet, what she cited was not the main text of the Vigoya, but the commentaries of al-Laknawi, which Wang Xingjia translated. So in other words, through the engagement and the application of translation projects, Sinophone Muslim men and women reconfigured how people thought of Hanafi jurisprudence and carved out a legal space for women's mosques. When many Muslim men worried about how traditional Chinese culture was superstitious and corruptive, and on the contrary, Muslim female intellectuals spend very little time and effort in condemning the corruptions and superstitions brought by traditional Chinese cultures. So I want to take Aisha Tong Daoyun, for example. She was an active member of the Nationalist Party. In 1942, in the wartime capital Chongqing, she sponsored the renovation for the women's mosque there. And in 1948, she was elected as a national legislature, which, by the way, is 70 years earlier than the first Muslim women entered the United States Congress in 2018. Anyway, in an essay praising women in Islamic history, she begins her article somewhat unexpectedly. She wrote, quote, "Because men and women have always been equal throughout Chinese dynasties, especially since people value the modest teaching, women's position has been emphasized their time. As a result, Muslim women in China do not have a problem with their status," unquote. And of course, no one would take her assertion of gender equality in pre-modern China in a literal sense. But what she intended was clear. Women's education in either Chinese or Islamic tradition should not have been an issue. So, in sum, to educated Muslim women like Tong Daoyun, women's education and liberation were transcultural, if not universal. We can, of course, highlight their connection with the Nationalist Party and their educational background, which indicated that these women had relative higher class and they had access to traditional classic Chinese education. But so were their male counterparts, and men usually showed no hesitation in criticizing Chinese culture. To put it another way, it could be said that because male Muslims took the Chinese language, culture, and education for granted, they were able to compartmentalize their world, delineating the boundaries between religion and superstition, and between the Islamic and the Chinese. In contrast, women did not have that luxury. Every liberating element mattered, even if they came from the backward Chinese traditions. So that concludes my presentation today, and I look forward to your questions.